Hey YouTubers, how you doing today? My name's Amidio602, and today we're going to walk through all of the settings that I have set up for Warzone Caldera. So jumping right into it, we are going to go into a private match in Warzone orientation. Now keep in mind, a couple things to know about this orientation is, number one, the FPS that you see in the orientation is going to be slightly higher than what you're going to see in Rebirth, and the FPS that you see in Rebirth is going to be slightly higher than you see in the Caldera map. So first of all, what I like to do when I'm testing different settings changes is just drop into orientation, because that way no one's messing around with me. But please do keep in mind that the FPS that we see in here today is going to be a little bit higher than what you are going to see in the Warzone. And that's mostly because of CPU time. Some of you, very few of you, may be GPU limited, and in that case you might see just around the same FPS, but in general, Warzone is a CPU limited game, so the very first thing you should do before doing any of this is check out some of the other videos on the channel about how you can optimize your PC for Warzone. Without further ado, let's jump right into the settings. In the graphics tab, you can see display is set to full screen. This is very important. Now, some of you might be using full screen borderless, and the issue with that, there are two issues with that. Number one is it's going to decrease your FPS. Number two is it could increase your input lag. So I always recommend full screen. The only real downside of full screen is that when you alt-tab out of the game, then your whole screen's going to turn black for a few seconds. Not that big of a deal. You shouldn't be alt-tabbing out in the middle of the game anyway, so I strongly recommend full screen, although if you had to pick something else, full screen borderless is a very distant second place. Your display monitor, this is a PC with only one monitor, so there's only one choice here. This should be your highest resolution, highest refresh rate monitor. You can see here in my case I've got an NVIDIA RTX 3070. Down here, your screen refresh rate. This is very important, and this is something that Warzone every now and then will screw up. And if your monitor has an on-screen display for the frame rate, I would recommend you use it, because occasionally Warzone will start sending out 120 frames per second to my monitor, even though this is set to 170. And there's a little bit of a bug here. If you pick a different refresh rate here and tell it to apply, what's going to happen is when it comes back, it still shows 170. The on-screen display on my monitor, however, has the correct value at 144. So that's a display bug. You need to be careful about that. Be sure that this is set to the highest refresh rate that your monitor can support. Next, under render resolution, for most people this should be 100%. I play in 1440p on a 27-inch monitor, and this render resolution should be 100% of whatever you're displaying. Now, if you're on 1080p, you might get a little bit of a frame boost if you increase this, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, except when you think about the GPU is optimized for 1440p. For some people, that can have a little bit of a positive impact, but most people want to keep this at 100. And down here, you can see here's where you can change your display resolution. 1440p, which is what I have selected here, is what I use to game on. It's what I recommend. You will see a little bit fewer frames with 1440p compared to 1080p, which is this 1920 by 1080 down here. But in my opinion, it's worth it because the visual experience is so much better. So basically, you're trading a little bit of performance for being able to see things a little bit better. Down here under dynamic resolution, you definitely want to have this disabled. This option lets you change your settings on the fly. It'll tell Warzone to change the settings on the fly just to meet a certain frame rate target. Typically, you don't want to have that enabled. The next option underneath that doesn't really matter because this is disabled, so this doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want with that slider. For aspect ratio, just leave that at automatic. VSync. You always want to have VSync disabled. We've talked about this in some of the other videos. The issue with VSync is it tries to keep everything in sync. As long as you're not running into a lot of screen tearing, leave it disabled, shouldn't be a problem. If you are seeing the screen tearing, you can enable it. Just be sure to keep a really close eye on your frame rate and make sure that it's not impacting that too much. The custom frame rate limit. As you can see here, I have mine set to custom with a frame rate limit of 300, which is essentially unlimited for this PC. And in the menus and when I'm out of focus, which means I've alt-tabbed out to another program, you can see I've got lower frame rates set here. For the most part, this just lets the GPU and the CPU have a chance to recover in between maps, and it doesn't run the menus as fast as it can. You can also just leave this at unlimited, not a big deal. Under brightness, my brightness is set to 55. You can play with this value a little bit. I wouldn't personally change it plus or minus more than about 5. I don't like to do a whole lot of messing around with brightness because it can skew some of the rest of the display that you see. For display gamma, this is dependent on whether you're using a monitor or a TV. Since this is a PC setup guide, I'm going to assume most of you are using monitors, and you should leave this at 2.2. For NVIDIA highlights, you definitely want to have this disabled. You'll also want to go into the NVIDIA control panel and disable it there as well, just to be sure that it's disabled. NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency. This is one of those options that is going to vary for different people. If you have an all-core manual overclock on your CPU and it's always running at the same frequency and your GPU's overclocked, you could probably go ahead and leave this disabled. If you have a system that is GPU limited, and those are very few and far between in the Warzone, then you would want to have enabled, and for the rest of us that are CPU limited, you typically want to have this set as enabled plus boost. Next, we've got the quality tab. The field of view is mostly personal preference. I would recommend something at least 90 if you're playing on PC. This is one of the hugely controversial topics between PC and console, and the console players don't even have this as an option, so theirs is just set to the default. This is one of the major advantages of playing on PC, is having this field of view slider, so go ahead and be sure that that's set to some value greater than the default. Under Advanced, we've got the ADS field of view. You have two choices here. You've got Affected and Independent. Under Independent, when you ADS, the field of view shrinks down to whatever the default is. I believe it's 80. Under Affected, then when you ADS, that field of view does not shrink. Independent makes it easier to hit your shots at long range, but it also gives you tunnel vision. If you have it on Affected, then you don't have the tunnel vision, but it might be a little bit harder to hit shots with that default scope. Under camera movement, by default this is set to 100%. I recommend lowering it to 50%, and this just decreases the amount of camera shake that you see in the screen. When you're in the game, you can't actually change the streaming quality here. You have to change this from the main menu. I strongly recommend setting this to low. Under texture resolution, this one seems like it might have a major impact on your FPS, and it does have a little bit of an impact, but it's not huge. I like to have mine set to normal so that the textures look reasonably good and still load pretty quickly. You could set it to high if you have a high-end system. You could set it to very low if you've got a very low-end system and you just want to get the most frames possible. But for me, I like it normal. By the way, my PC is an AMD Ryzen 5600X, an NVIDIA RTX 3070, with 16 gigabytes of RAM clocked at 3600 MHz with a cast latency of 16. Next, we have Texture Filter Anisotropic, and I've been playing around with this setting a little bit. I don't notice much of a difference in game when I'm playing, but there is a difference in FPS, so I would recommend setting this to low if you're trying to maximize your FPS. Under particle quality, similar principles apply. Low, high, I don't notice a big difference. If you look at the screen on the right here, there's not really a huge difference in that, especially when there's a lot going on, so I go ahead and leave this set on low. Bullet impact and sprays, I leave these enabled so I can see where bullets are hitting. Under tessellation, I like to disable this for better performance, and the same holds true for dismemberment and gore effects. They don't cause a huge performance drop from what I've seen, but I leave that disabled. On-demand texture streaming is crucial. You absolutely must have this disabled for best performance. I don't care if you're on a spaceship PC or a Rocky clunker. Leave this disabled because otherwise you're going to have downloads going on in the background, and that is definitely going to hurt your performance. That's going to induce packet bursts, that's going to induce possibly even frame drops. You don't want to have this set to high or standard quality, just leave this completely disabled. You can see in here none of it matters once that's disabled. Post-processing effects takes a little bit more to explain, and I'm not really sure why filmic strength is the first option. I think the first option in here should be anti-aliasing because a lot of these other options depend on it, so I'm going to skip around here a little bit. First, I want to hit on anti-aliasing. Anti-aliasing has a huge impact on your frames per second and a noticeable impact on the visual display of your game. So if you want the most beautiful game possible, go ahead and crank this all the way up to Filmic SMAA T2X, and that's going to give you the best looking display. When you do that, you want to set your filmic strength to 0, and you might also want to mess with some of the other options down below. But for me, I prefer a pretty good looking game with the highest FPS that I can get reasonably, so I like to leave this set to 1x. Sometimes I'll put it to 2x. I'm not 100% sure on Caldera yet where this is going to end up, so play with this, see which one you prefer. But if you're on the 1x, then the filmic strength here, you can see in the comment, should be set to 1 to avoid visual noise issues. And you'll also want to remember what you set your anti-aliasing to, because there are some options down below where that has an impact. No matter what your anti-aliasing is set to, your film grain should always be set to 0. You don't want extra noise in the game, you don't want extra grainy dots all over your screen. I'm not sure why that's even an option. Just leave that to 0 no matter what your configuration. Under DLSS, some people really like DLSS and they really need to enable it to boost those frame rates. I recommend disabling it. Personally, I do not like it. If you like it and you are okay with how the game looks when it's enabled, leave it enabled. For me personally, I would rather have a better looking game with a few fewer frames. Ugh, tongue twister. I would rather have a few fewer frames with DLSS disabled than enable it and have a blurry looking game. Under depth of field, absolutely disable this and be sure to check your settings from time to time, because Warzone for whatever reason likes to override the settings file. You can also browse to the settings file and mark it as read-only once you're done. That's something I may have to go do at the end of this video. But you definitely want to have the last 3 of these disabled. Depth of field, world motion blur, weapon motion blur. Disable all those, it's just going to mess you up. Under shadow and lighting, you have shadow map resolution. And for this, I like normal. If you want, you can have more complicated shadows if you turn that up, but it is going to cost you frames. Under cache spot shadows and cache sun shadows, I would strongly recommend having these enabled for everyone. What this does is it lets your GPU avoid recalculating the shadows based on sunspots, and that's going to help your FPS. Under particle lighting, you can have this set wherever you like. Personally, I like this on low. I don't find that that's something that really impacts my game very much. The next setting is DirectX ray tracing. This one is very important, and everyone should have this disabled. If you have a high-end system and you have it enabled because you think it looks beautiful, turn it off and just see how the game looks without it. I think you'll agree with me that disabled is the way to go here. The last 2 options are based on your anti-aliasing. If you have anti-aliasing at 1x or disabled, both of these should be disabled. If you're playing around with the T2X or the Filmic T2X anti-aliasing options, you can play around with these and see how they look. Keep in mind that both of these are going to have an impact on your FPS, so be sure that that FPS counter is displayed in the top left. Speaking of which, let's go into the interface section. Under interface, the subtitles is largely personal preference. Colorblind, some people swear by turning on the various colorblind types. Personally, I leave that disabled. I leave the tooltips enabled. And you can also change where your HUD displays here. And a lot of people will like to take this and squeeze it in as far as possible, just so their eyes don't have to move as much to look at the minimap and their ammo and things like that. I personally just leave these set to the default. Your minimap should absolutely be square, and you can see in the image here, if you look at the square minimap, it covers about 20% more area than that round minimap. So do yourself a favor and be square. Under minimap rotation, this is largely personal preference. I like to have it enabled so that the minimap is always the way that I'm facing. Under compass cardinal direction text, you can either have 270 display the letter W for west, or you can have it display the number 270. Again, largely personal preference. When I'm playing, we like to call out north, south, east, and west when it makes sense, or call out numbers, so we leave this set to letters. For the kill feed duration, I believe this is a new option in Warzone right now. This is the first time I've noticed this option, at least. You can leave this at the default, but I like to have an extended kill feed duration because that way I can see who my teammates have been killing and who's been killing my teammates, and I know when somebody comes back from the gulag if that's the second time that we've killed them, things like that. So personally, I like to leave this on extended. For my text chat, I have that completely disabled. I don't need to be typing messages to people during the game, and if somebody decides to send me a message, I don't really want to take the time to read it because it's probably not that important. Under System, we've got an FPS counter enabled. I also have the server latency, packet loss, GPU time, temperature, CPU time, lots of these different things enabled. The only thing I really have disabled is the system clock. If you wanted to see the time of day while you were playing, you could enable that. When you are playing the game, and this is very important, when you are playing the game, if you have CPU time and GPU time enabled, it will tell you the amount of time that that component took to render a frame. And you want this number to be as low as possible. Low is fast. High is slow. The higher value of time is the bottleneck of your system. And if the CPU time is higher, then you could also have a RAM bottleneck. You can see here I've got home theater set. I haven't really messed with this too much. The music in this game I feel like is really loud, so I've got that turned way down. A lot of you might want to have that turned off. And down here you can see the rest of this, and most of this is going to be dependent on your system. The mics in Warzone Caldera, for whatever reason, are very quiet. Voice chat seems to be very quiet, so I've increased the voice chat volume here. That's the volume at which I hear other people through game chat. And I've also increased the microphone volume. That is my outgoing volume from my microphone. Under controller, and I typically do play with controller, not keyboard and mouse. I'm using the mouse pointer here just to make it obvious what I'm talking about. I prefer tactical flipped layout. Under the layout preset, I use default. Under invert vertical look, I have selected air vehicles only. This means that when I'm in the fighter plane, up will be down, down will be up. It'll be like you're in a real plane flying, and I prefer that. Next, I'd like to talk about how to properly set your left and right stick input dead zone. You can see right now, I'm not using my controller. It is connected to the system, and the menus are just fine while I browse around with a keyboard and mouse. While you have your keyboard and mouse connected, by the way, this works for PlayStation players as well, go ahead and change your dead zone to something very small like 0. Notice now, as I move the mouse around, the interface is changing. You can see L1 and R1 appearing on the menu. I'm not touching the controller. This is because the dead zone is too low. So if you're in the menus and you see your menus messing up like this and switching back and forth, that means your dead zone is too low on either your left or your right stick. Notice if I change this back up, now the menus stop doing that. So the trick here is to find the lowest value that you can for each of the left and right stick where your menus don't mess up. You can see for me that's a 0.03. If I change it to 0.02, you can see my menus are starting to mess up a little bit. There it goes, right there. So just from that right there, you can tell that the proper value for this controller is 0.03. And once I set that, it stopped doing it. The same is true for the right stick. If you slide that all the way down, you'll notice the menus just kind of act up like crazy, even at 0.02. At 0.14, you can see it's back up, it's acting normally again. And you want this to be as low as possible so that you have precise aim and movement, but you don't want it too low because you don't want the game to register movement that isn't yours. So again, we're going to set that to 0.03. For the max dead zone, typically a 1.0 is what you want. I've never seen anyone need to change this to decrease it, so I can't really give you any tips on that. Under sensitivity, it's whatever works best for you. I've got a 7.7 right now with a multiplier of 0.8. I have the custom sensitivity at various zoom levels disabled. I might play around with this at some point, but I haven't gotten there yet. Under the aim response curve type, I've tried standard and dynamic. They both feel pretty much the same to me, so this is largely personal preference. Just change around and see what you prefer. I definitely like to have the controller vibration disabled because when it's enabled, that can mess up your aim if you're getting shot and you're trying to fight back. Under aim assist, I like to have standard. I have this disabled. Scaling aim assist with the field of view is disabled because otherwise, if I'm sitting there watching a doorway and somebody comes running past, because my field of view is wider than that default, what happens is my aim will jump off of that person, so my aim will actually lead them and I'll end up missing shots because of this. So this is a good one to leave disabled if you run a wide field of view. For weapon mount, largely personal preference. For movement exit, I have that enabled. That way you can just back up and get off of that mount quickly. For ADS behavior, I like to hold to have ADS. For steady aim, I prefer toggle because if you're holding in on that left stick while you're trying to move and aim, sometimes that can mess me up. So I really appreciate the addition of this accessibility option. Equipment behavior, I have left at the default on hold. For use reload, I really like contextual tap because that way I can control whether I'm reloading or picking up items. And the last two here are largely personal preference. You can see with all those settings, we're right around 195 FPS on my system. Our GPU and CPU time are both at 5 milliseconds, and that's really what you want. You want those numbers to be very close. For the most part, most systems are going to be CPU limited in Warzone or possibly even RAM limited. Most of the time, it's not your GPU. If you stuck around this long in the video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on my future tips, tricks, and tactics videos. And as always, thank you very much for watching.